I was 30 years old. And I always regretted not having sat down with him, and said, look, tell me those stories you used to tell when I was a kid on tape. In fact, I even bought a little tape recorder, a Sony Walkman, when he was the last time he was in the hospital, and I forgot to take it with me when I went to visit him. And he died 2 weeks later, so I never got to do that, even though I had the idea. 6 years later, he was still receiving mail, and a newsletter came addressed to him 6 years after he died, and it was a newsletter from his old tank battalion. I said, whoa, my dad was in a tank, I'd forgotten that, So I wrote to the newsletter's editor, and I said, if anybody remembers my father, could they get in touch with me? I'd like to reconstruct the stories he told when I was a kid. By return post, I got a letter that said, according to the records, I didn't know your father, but he was in my company, and there's going to be a reunion in a couple of weeks. There's no time to get something in the newsletter. Why don't you come to the reunion? I'll take you around, introduce you. So I went, and I met 3 people who remembered my dad. I had the tape recorder. I sat down with one of them, and he talked to me for about 20 minutes, just about my father and how he reported as a replacement. I knew my father had replaced the first lieutenant. My dad was a lieutenant. He replaced the first lieutenant in a tank in the battalion to be killed. He had always said that. So I was able to get the name of that lieutenant and the circumstances of how he was killed. And the fellow I recorded was his sergeant, and my father had reported to him, and he told me how my dad said to him, look, I've trained with the infantry. I've only been in a tank once, and that's how it showed up on my records, so they assigned me to a tank battalion. And the sergeant explained to me how he told my dad, look, I'll show you around, and he gave him a tour of the tank. We got a tank driver here I was talking to a little while ago. Anyway, he explained to my father, look, this is way high up. Be careful getting off. And my father said, yes, certainly. Jumped off the tank and sprained his ankle and went to the aid station, and the tanks went into battle without him. And the next day, he hitched a ride with another platoon, went up to try to find his tank, and was wounded before he ever found it. He was hit with shrapnel. Sent to England, recuperated, came back, and again was wounded within a matter of days. But I learned all the stories my father told when I was a kid came back to life, and many stories that I didn't hear, and it was just an amazing experience for me. 36 years old, I felt like a kid, But at the same time, at this reunion, they had a hospitality room, and they were all, this was 1987, it's almost 20 years ago, and these guys who were 82 and 83 now, they were 62 and 63, the older ones were about 68, and they could still put away a couple of beers. They could take a bottle of scotch, at the beginning of the hospitality suite, and it would be empty by the end. Now they can't do that anymore, doctor's orders. But they would loosen up and start reliving the war and reminiscing. And the stories they told, I quickly realized, were stories they didn't tell to their families. So I went back. I missed the next reunion in 1988, and I went back in 1989 with the tape recorder, and I began grabbing them by the arm and saying, look, I heard you tell this story in the parking lot. Would you tell it to me, on tape? So for the next few years, I'd go around, like a nut with a tape recorder, and they say, oh, we're telling lies and, embellishing stuff. But I managed to preserve a good piece of history of that individual unit. One thing led to another, and I wrote a book called Tanks for the Memories. The title is not mine. They had a bumper sticker that said, Tanks for the Memories, 712th Tank Battalion from World War II. But I used it for the title of the book, and I put some of the stories in it, and I couldn't find a publisher. As many of you know, probably, there have been so many books written about World War II. So, one fellow who had told me a story, a very compelling story about how in the middle of a battle, an infantryman came rushing out of the basement, and he had this dazed expression. And he said, you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it. He's wandering around like in shock with firing going on all around him. It turned out he'd gone into this basement, and a woman was having a baby. And, it was such a, he told this story over lunch, and I got him to put it on tape. Well, the reunion ended. This fellow went home, and the next newsletter reported that as soon as he got home, he discovered he had an advanced cancer, and he was dead within weeks. And I was still trying to find a literary agent or a publisher. I pulled every string I could. I have a cousin who's the editor of The Nation, the prestigious, if a little left-wing journal, and he couldn't even find me an agent. And I said, look, these people are beginning to pass away. One literary agent wrote back to me and said, well, even if your stories were told by somebody with a more recognizable name, it would still be 2 years before it got into print. And look at your audience. This agent thought my audience would be, World War II veterans. Half of them will be dead in 2 years. Baloney. But anyway, my audience, the way I figured it, was people like myself who have a parent or a grandparent or an uncle who was in World War II and who didn't really talk about what went on. And here I am talking about myself when I should be talking about some of the people that I've met and some of the stories that I've collected. Anyway, what I was going to say is one thing led to another. I wrote this book. I started a website. The internet was kind of in its infancy at the time. I published the book in '94. The internet was just gaining, becoming a phenomenon. So I started a website to promote the book because I knew the New York Times would never review it. Armor magazine called it must reading for any tanker, which was kind of nice. But it was stories told by tankers who were in World War II. So I started this website, and I called it World War II Oral History. I figured I'd give it a nice, pretentious name. And I would tell people, as I recorded stories, I would say, I'm like an oral history. The fact is, I am an oral historian. I began to realize this. So I put all these tanker stories up on the website, and people would email me and say, how come you call it World War II Oral History, and all you have is tankers? So I began to look for other veterans to interview. I worked for a newspaper, the Bergen Record, up in Hackensack, and on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, they were looking for D-Day veterans. So I wrote to Stephen Ambrose, and he asked for a list, if he knew of any D-Day veterans in the New Jersey area. At the time, I lived in a high-rise. Meanwhile, Ambrose sent me back a list of about a dozen names, and I interviewed several of them. I lived in a high-rise in Hackensack at the time, and I was going up in the elevator, and there's this elderly fellow who knew what I do, and he was in the elevator with another elderly fellow, and he said, I understand you're looking for D-Day veterans. And I said, yes. And the other fellow, who I didn't know, but he lived in the building, he said, I'm a D-Day veteran. And I said, oh, yes? And I said, what outfit were you with? And he pointed to his crotch. I said, well, wait a minute. So I looked, I hesitantly looked down, and he's got a belt buckle with a screaming eagle. And I said, oh, you were in the 82nd Airborne Division. He said, no, I was in the 101st. But anyway, he had been the head of or the former president of the New York, New Jersey chapter of the 101st Airborne Division. He dragged me to a meeting of theirs, and I began to interview D-Day veterans, a couple of paratroopers. Another fellow had been in the infantry, in the 90th Infantry Division, behind one of the tanks in one of the stories that I had gathered. He was wounded, lost a leg, and captured. Not in that order. A German doctor amputated his leg. And he became the head of the New York, New Jersey chapter, actually the New Jersey chapter of the American ex-POWs, because he had been a prisoner of war. He said, you want stories, come with me to a meeting of the ex-POWs. They meet every Tuesday in the Lyons VA Medical Center. So I went down to a few of their meetings, and he was right. You know, the stories that they told, that they had to tell, I began, recording them and putting some of them up on the internet. And, one thing led to another, so I found a couple of Marines to interview, and because, people would say, oh, you're a World War II oral history, where are the Marines? Where's the Pacific? But the website, which is tankbooks.com, one word, tankbooks, and there's a ton of stories that are up there, some transcripts of interviews, the full text of 3 of my books, and most of the fourth are up there, you can read for free. The idea is these are not my stories, I just want to get them out there, to preserve them, to make them available. A lot of high schools, middle schools, link to the website, which is, it's kind of a good feeling. But anyway, I want to read a couple of stories from the interviews that I've done over the years. Not all interviews, some are letters, a couple of stories that were written, and I'm not going to have time to do all that I say I would like to do. But for starters, I'd like to introduce you to one of the most unique voices that I've encountered. There are a lot of writers came out of World War II. This is a fellow who was in my father's tank battalion. He went to Harvard, he was a lawyer, but he went into the service as a private, became a sergeant in the horse cavalry, got a battlefield commission. When I interviewed him, he was already in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. And his memory was, a little fuzzy about some things. But he had, right after the war, they had a unit history that the government, or the Army, sponsored all these individual units to write their own histories. And he had done the writing for this little pamphlet. It's about 80 pages long. And the writing is so eloquent in that. Well, even though it was not the greatest interview, it was still pretty good. He mentioned that he had put together a compilation of letters that he wrote home. His father died when he was a kid, but he wrote to his mother and his sister, and they saved all his letters. And later in life, he had he was from Cincinnati, and a historical association out there got him to take those letters and put together a little booklet of excerpts that they used in their journal. And his letters are so eloquent. I'd just like to read a couple of excerpts from them. Now, he was a lieutenant. He got a battlefield commission. His name is Morse Johnson, and actually he was a philanthropist, and there's a statue of him, or not of him, but inspired by him. It's kind of artsy, in Cincinnati in front of a theater that I guess he helped fund. This is a letter that he wrote to his mother, or his sister, or both. I was trying to tingle my frozen feet by kicking them up against my tank when an infantry column went by. One doughboy, now, when I started doing this, because all the tankers referred to the infantry as doughboys, you know, that's a term that I would use when I would write a story about them or do something at the newspaper. And oh, did my editors get on my case? Doughboys weren't in World War II, doughboys were World War I. But that's what they called them, doughboy. There was no perspective. I was trying to tingle my frozen feet, kicking them up against my tank when an infantry column went by. One doughboy was carrying the base plate of a 3-inch mortar weighing 42 pounds and another ammo weighing 45 pounds. I looked at the hill they had just mounted, at the slush and their mud-caked boots. I looked at one frail, bespectacled, sensitive little fellow who held his rifle at high port. For some 200 yards ahead, there were Heinies. In civilian life, no doubt, he had punched an adding machine in a nice warm office. His thin legs were covered with muck. As he went by, I grinned and said, "Rugged go, huh, Mac?" And he responded with congenial determination. The next night, we bivouacked in the woods. It was bitter cold, wet, and the wind was biting. I was cursing war, Hitler, and everything else, and climbed out of the tank to confer with a doughboy who had dug in some 10 yards away. Our shells and Heine shells were whistling overhead, and nothing is more devastating than a tree burst. The doughboys had their uniforms and 2 blankets for all 4, nothing else. They were climbing into their foxholes. On the bottom of each were puddles of water. Nevertheless, they were cheerful, snuggling into them as though they were as dry, warm, and commodious as feather beds. And yet, I have heard where some begrudge the infantryman's $10 combat pay. In these few incidents I have related, there is no description of the blood of actual battle. They are rather descriptions of the less perilous life of a combat doughboy. Bow down to him and praise him. This is another short excerpt from one of his letters, which I figured I would read because of the weather. The Christmas season remains the time of year when mothers and wives are the most lonesome and when soldiers are the most homesick. This deplorable, heart-rending, miserable mess that now embroils the world could be permanently put to sleep if the good that is inspired in us by Christmas were to become a daily habit instead of an annual celebration. I hate to say this, but I was crying all morning while I put this together. Some of this material is so emotional and so powerful. This is an excerpt from another letter that he wrote I don't believe I ever told you about Brooklyn. Brooklyn's in quotes. At one of our tight spots, we shared a room with an infantry squad, all of the members of which we got to know quite well. One was Brooklyn, obviously from Brooklyn. One night, he mentioned having written a song for his CO, and with little urging, sang it for us, with a song plugger's voice and style, like Irving Berlin or even Eddie Cantor. Good, I applauded, and it really was. Let's hear some more of your stuff. Here was an extrovert of the first order, and for a half hour he stood in the middle of a Heine kitchen, singing his songs and telling the story behind each, with a smart vaudevillian patter. I began to doubt whether all these songs were his, and told him so. At once, he asked me the name of my girl, which I faked, and my hometown. Not 5 seconds later, he was singing a catchy ditty about me, the girl, Cincinnati, etc. I told him to do the same for Mac, my driver, and he had just started when the guard rushed in and we had to rush out to repel the umpteenth counterattack. We worked with a lot of those boys. We worked a lot with those boys, and Ole's and my crew were always happy to see them. The other day, Brooklyn rode on my tank, and I coaxed him to write a song for us. At once, he burst out with a really dandy tune, the first words of which were, "There will be no more falling arches. There's no more walking, Yank. Going to hitch a ride. Going to hop inside. Going to Berlin on a tank." The tank stopped, and Brooklyn was just about to write it all down for me when his squad was called to clean out a slight pocket. We tanks were in close support, but the terrain did not permit us to be right with them. I guess I heard the shots. There were a lot of them, but I didn't see him get hit. I did see him, however, and fortunately, he had died instantly. Over the years, since I started doing this in 1987, I have collected, you might say, in the neighborhood of 600 hours of interviews with various veterans of World War II, some combat veterans, some women, some siblings of veterans who were killed. And all these tapes, they're in little 15 little cassette holders, plastic cases that hold 15 tapes each. And they're on a bookshelf, piled, you know, like at the top of the bookshelf. 600 hours of like incredible stories, important history. And the tapes already, some of the early ones, are beginning to deteriorate. About 3 years ago, as technology advanced, I thought, why don't I transfer the audio tape to compact disc? And that way it'll preserve them at least for another 20, 30 years, you know, until I can hook up with a legitimate university or an archive. As I did this, I found that with the software for the computer, which used to be very expensive, but now, you know, has come down in price so much that an amateur can do stuff that it took a seasoned professional to do a long time ago, not so long ago. But I found I could, as I transferred the original interview, I could edit out all the long pauses, all all the Oz, some of the Oz, some are important for effect, but I could do some editing, and I could break them into tracks like songs on a record album. And when I used to drive around the country. I'd plan a trip, stop and visit 8, 10 veterans along the way who didn't come to reunions, but who figured in stories, and I wanted to get their side of it. And as I would drive, I'd take my old interview tapes and I'd listen to them. One thing that I'm not originally a historian. I didn't set out to be, I always wanted to be a writer. I loved stories. And the thing that impressed me about these things that I was recording, they're great stories. And I would listen to my old interview tapes, not realizing that just by listening to them in a car stereo, in a car tape player, which was, would get overheated and, that was degrading these pieces of history as I listened to them. But I always viewed them as entertainment. Not entertainment like MTV or something, but these stories are, you can listen to them over and over again, or I can. So I thought, why not make audio books from these tapes, while at the same time preserving them so that the tapes don't degrade, or if they do, at least there's a copy of them. So that's what I've been doing. I've written 4 books early on of oral history of people that I've interviewed. But books are there just are so many, and it's so hard to get any kind of recognition for them. And the best books that I've read about World War II are the individual memoirs, many of them not even published, or published in an edition of maybe 100 or 1,000 copies. And they get lost. There are so many powerful books that have been written, and the only books that ever get any publicity or get onto the bestseller lists are books like Flags of Our Fathers, about the flag at Iwo Jima, books about D-Day, and books about the Battle of the Bulge, books by Tom Brokaw, because he's got a name. It's very hard to get any kind of recognition. So I thought, I'm going to focus on these entertaining CDs. So, Brandon, could you play track 1? Before you do it, let me give you a little background on, I just completed the CD that this excerpt is from. In 1993, I interviewed a fellow named Jim Flowers. He was the first real hero that I had met. At the very first reunion I went to, there was this grizzled, he had been a tank commander, he was a farmer, he had this mean look. And I overheard him talking when Jim Flowers, this fellow I interviewed later, when he showed up at the reunion, he started talking about Jim Flowers. Flowers was a lieutenant. He had a platoon of tanks, 5 tanks, and he had led this platoon to the rescue of a battalion, I think that's about 800 men of infantry, that was cut off at the top of a hill in Normandy. They were surrounded by Germans. He took his 4 tanks at the time, broke through the resistance, and led the infantry down off the hill. The infantry got to the bottom of the hill under heavy enemy fire and dug in. And the communication was so poor that he kept going. And he had almost no infantry support with him. He had 4 tanks, and they ran right into an ambush, and all 4 tanks were destroyed. 9 of his 20 men in his platoon with him that they were killed. He lost, when a shell entered his tank, it took off his right forefoot. He still managed to reach down, pull his gunner out of the tank, get out himself, engage in hand-to-hand combat, and he lay out in no man's land with his gunner and an infantryman for 2 days. During those 2 days, the Americans shelled the area, and he lost his other foot to so-called friendly fire. And he was rescued on the third morning. At this first reunion I went to, this grizzled farmer who had this mean expression was talking about this guy, Jim Flowers, and he said that when he had been in the same company, he was a sergeant, had known him a long time. He said when he learned that Flowers had survived this battle, he cried. And there I was, 36 years old, with all this macho stuff around me, tankers, grizzled veterans. The concept of at the time, a young man, a tank commander, crying was foreign to me. So I became fascinated by this. And so I took Jim Flowers aside. He walked with two artificial legs, but he wouldn't use a cane. He was very proud, very stoic. And he was the fellow who first told me about the lieutenant my father replaced, because he had seen this other lieutenant moments before he was killed. Anyway, a couple of years later, in 1993, I finally got Flowers to get his whole story down. And the interview went from, it filled up 4 tapes, 2 90-minute tapes and 2 60-minute tapes, from July 3rd until July 10th when he was wounded, and July 12th when he was rescued. And this is an excerpt from that tape, if you could decide track 1.
Sometime the next day on the 11th, our artillery shelled that position, and they ended the war for some of the German kids, because I could hear them screaming. And one of the shells, there's several of them landed nearby. As a matter of fact, I was almost covered up by dirt. They say you hit and explode and throwing dirt at them. But one of them landed just right to hit the infantry, shell fragments from it hit the infantry soldier and me, and did almost complete traumatic amputation of my left leg, this time about 7 inches below my knee. And I had to get this belt off of my right leg over to my left one. But I haven't got all that much blood left, especially since I'm pretty well dehydrated. I take the belt off of my right leg, put it on the left, and pull it up as tightly as I can, twisted the stick, and slowed the blood down, and I checked Rothschild. No, he didn't get any shell fragment. How's your take?
So far, so good.
Okay. The infantry boy has been hit. He's been hit hard. So I crawled, pulled myself over on my elbows over to him, and he's a bloody damn mess. I can't just lay there calmly and let this little boy join his ancestors in heaven or wherever. With whatever motility I have left in my bandaged hands, I managed to tear some of his clothing off of him and get it ripped up into strips to put some compresses over the places where he's bleeding badly. And I did the best job I could, and with the limited resources that were available to me. We made it through the rest of the day, and then that night, this is the night of the 11th now. I couldn't tell you whether it's full or dark or not. I don't remember. The Germans evacuated after they fell back. And that leaves, in the meantime, our artillery had stopped trying to kill me. This boy named Frank Norris, that was one of the artillery battalion commanders, told me the night I've accused Frank of trying to kill me. He didn't even know me. But we laugh about it. He admits that it could have been his battalion that was firing on that position. I thought it was Corps artillery, back it seems like it's much of it could have been Corps artillery. But we made it through the remainder of the night of the 11th, morning of the 12th, the infantry soldier, mind you, we haven't had a bite to eat. I like to eat. I haven't had anything to drink, and I like water. We needed water. Sometime on the morning of the 12th, this infantry soldier, he wasn't going to make it. He's about gone. And Rothschild was pretty quiet. Rothschild was part of an Indian boy from Indian reservation up in Walden, Minnesota. Some Indians are rather stoic anyhow, and he was one of them. A fine man. Turned out that after the war, Rothschild went back home as a dairy farmer for many, many years, getting back to the infantry soldier. He said he wasn't going to make it. He asked me to administer the last rites to him, and I said, hell, I don't know whether I told him, but I'm not a Catholic boy. I'm a Baptist. I don't understand anything about the last rites of the Catholic Church, but to please him, why I crawled over and did the best I could, but at the same time, I can pray. That's one thing I can do. I admonish this boy for even thinking about dying, and ask him to just hang on a while longer. They'll be here eventually to get us. He didn't make it. sometime that morning, I guess, I heard some noise coming from back in the direction of Hill 122. And the first clear recollection I have is hearing this voice say, well, here's some more of them. And then said, well, here's another one. He says coming my way. And they got up close to me while one of these boys says, I think these are still alive.
One little note about that, he had told me that I should go interview his gunner, Jim Rothschild, who he had not seen, since the war. And Rothschild, he had told me he's an Indian, and he lives on an Indian reservation, Waupun, Minnesota. I went out to Waupun, Minnesota. It's in the middle of the White Earth Indian Reservation. But Jim Rothschild is Czechoslovakian, which goes a little more with his name. And he explained to me that his father was an immigrant from Czechoslovakia, and they wound up in Fargo, North Dakota. North Dakota or south? North, isn't it? Anyway, in Fargo. And the Indians, some congressman had passed a bill allowing them to sell some of their land on the reservation. So they sold it for $5 an acre, $2 or $3 or $4 an acre. Basically, they got swindled out of their land. And these Czechoslovakian immigrants got swindled into buying it for $40 or $50 an acre, and they became farmers. But that's how he wound up in the middle of an Indian reservation. And even though his father was swindled, it still was very productive land. But just the way it was purchased is wrong. But he had done a lot of research into that. Anyway, that's an example of the material that's on these audio CDs, and it just is so compelling, if I say so myself. Now, I know these people, I can put a face with them, but I think even just to listen to them is really very powerful, even if you don't know much about them. And there's more information on them at my website. Going back to the book that I published, after I wrote Tanks for the Memories, I got a phone call from a fellow who was a neighbor of somebody I had interviewed for one of the 50th anniversary D-Day articles, and he wanted advice. So I said, sure, I'll give you advice on self-publishing. And he was a Holocaust survivor. His name is Jack Zilberman. And he had written his memoir on a Macintosh computer that he bought with Holocaust reparations. He got some money from the German government, spent probably $2,000 on this computer, had no hard drive. He had 40 chapters on 40 different discs, and he printed it out. Anyway, the advice that I gave him, I wound up typing the whole thing over twice, because I typed it up once, and in the meantime he had gone back on his discs and made changes, not knowing that the changes on the disc wouldn't appear in what I had typed. So I wound up typing his whole book twice, and his brother, who also was a Holocaust survivor, had agreed to pay for the printing, but I helped him keep his costs down to like $4,000, as opposed to going to a vanity publisher where it would have cost him $10,000 or $12,000 to have it printed. Anyway, one thing led to another, And I've advised a lot of people on self-publishing their books. And one day, I got a call from, again, somebody who was a neighbor of somebody I had written about. And he said he had written a book and he was having trouble getting it published. Would I take a look at it? He had been a chaplain in Vietnam. And I said, sure, send me a copy, I'll take a look at it. His name is Connell McGuire. And the reason I mention this is because two of Father Joe, Joseph Connell McGuire, two of his sisters are here, Teresa and Kate, today. Would you stand up? Anyway, Father Joe sent me this manuscript, and it was about his childhood in Ireland, about his family's
Lady Bardsley, please go to the copier room.
His family's emigration to Philadelphia, which has some local import, about how he joined the priesthood and some of the priests he met, about serving in Vietnam, about serving in the Navy, and about retirement. And it was all a series of vignettes and two short one-act plays, because he wanted to be a playwright before he joined the priesthood. And he sent me this manuscript, and I began reading it, and I fell in love with it. It was one of the most charming books I'd ever read. And I called him up, and because he wanted me to help him find a publisher, give him some advice. I said, look, I'm not Random House, but I would like to publish this book. So it was the first book that I published that was not written by me or written by somebody else with that person paying the printing costs. And I got a call from Father Joe yesterday, and he told me that his neighbor, Kay Hutchins, who had been the person who I wrote about, had passed away. She had been ill for quite some time. And that's when I told him I was going to be speaking here, and he called his sisters, and they showed up tonight. So I'd like to read one of these stories from his book, which is called Follies of a Navy Chaplain. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this microphone working? Now this is a little vignette about Philadelphia called To Go Up or Not to Go Up the River. His father had a small grocery store, is that correct? After the Depression, or during it. Mr. Ireland, I'll call him. We used to see him in the autumn of his life, a bit bent, weary from working in landscaping, heading home. Okay, this one works fine. You can hear this, right? Mr. Ireland, I'll call him. We used to see him in the autumn of his life, a bit bent, weary from working in landscaping, heading home. It's okay? He was still a striking hulk of a man. We looked at him in awe because of the report that he had boxed champion Jack Johnson in the Army during World War I. He had been in the same regiment with a Philadelphian wounded in the war, later a lawyer and candidate for judge. The prospective judge is well remembered because of the hullabaloo which occurred when his opponent accused him of trading on his wounds for political advantage. The criticism backfired with a vengeance. Prohibition of alcohol was gone when we got to know Mr. Ireland, But while it was in force, our man got in trouble for making moonshine. We heard that he added to his legal difficulties by throwing the plainclothes raiders out on the street. There were sharpers abroad in those days who intimidated the accused and solicited money, promising to fix the case. My father was similarly beset for the same problem. Just this moment, I spoke with my brother in Milwaukee, who witnessed and contributed to my father's travail. In struggling to support 7 children, my father brewed beer. Since people came in and out of the store, he could sell it unnoticed. The police were sympathetic and told him that he had been betrayed by a bad neighbor and they had to arrest him. Danny, then a wee boy, saw the police come inside from the store and asked them, "Do you want some beer?" A helpful son. My father's name was Barney, so I'll call Mr. Ireland Barney too. He was approached by 2 men demanding some hundreds of dollars to fix his case. "If you don't pay up, you're going up the river," they threatened. Up the river meant jail. Barney refused to deal with them, took his chances, and appeared in court. When his name came up, the judge looked back and forth at Barney and the name on the docket. "Are you the Barney Ireland who served in the army in France in the World War?" He specified the battalion and regiment. "I am, Your Honor." The judge left the bench, came down, and shook hands with Barney. What a great country this would be if we had more men like Barney Ireland. You might raise your eyebrows and question this statement, but wait on. A lieutenant was wounded and lying exposed to enemy fire. Barney seized a machine gun and single-handedly drove Germans away. He then ran out amid the crashing shells, picked up the lieutenant on his shoulders, and carried him to safety. The lieutenant was now the judge. The case was dismissed, and the judge invited Barney to lunch. As he left the courtroom, Barney encountered the 2 sharpers standing by the door who witnessed the whole scene. "See," said Barney calmly, "I'm not going up the river." He's working on a sequel, which I hope against hope to have out by Christmas. But he sent me one story. Now he was a priest in Philadelphia. At which church was his parish?
St. Mary the Eternal.
St. Mary's
Of the Eternal.
of the Eternal. And one of the stories he sent was about a rather coarse fellow that he's got for his sequel. It was about this rather coarse type of guy who you don't expect to see in church. I think he was a boxer. And he came and sat in the rear of the church one day and listened to the sermon. And he came up the next Sunday, and he went up to Father Joe, and he said, "You know, I bet on the number that you mentioned in your sermon, and the number came in, and I'm coming to church every Sunday." Now, Father Joe had not put any number in his sermon, didn't know about it, and he thought, now, correct me if I botch this, but there's a phrase in Latin, there's something spirit 220. And the boxer had gone and bet on 220, and the number came in. Now, I've probably taken up a lot of time. I would just like to play one more excerpt from the CDs, and then I'll answer questions if anybody has questions. Could you play like track 2? And this is some poetry, which since we began the program with a poem, I thought, now this is a former prisoner of war. And when I interviewed him, he had a book that he had kept in Stalag Luft 1, where he was a POW, and he had written down a collection. He didn't write the poems, but he preserved them.
Probably take questions right now.
Oh, okay, why don't I take some questions now? Does anyone have any questions? I'll tell you a little bit more about this fellow, Corman Bean. He lives in Michigan. And he was shot down during this air battle called the Castle Mission. Now, the way I learned about this, a bit of a convoluted trail, but it's amazing how, as I've done this, one thing leads to another. I went to Germany to visit the village where a buddy of my father was killed. And before I went, I tried to locate a local historian who could, there was a big, huge explosion in this village. And 5 people from the tank battalion were killed. This fellow lieutenant was one of them. I tried to locate a local historian who could, take me around and see if we could find some villagers who were present at the time of this explosion. So it turned out that one of the historians I met over there was a fellow named Walter Hassenflug. And Walter, when he was a 12-year-old boy, there was a huge air battle, like right over his community. And all these planes crashed. And he captured an American navigator who had bailed out. And as he grew up, he did all this research into all these planes that had crashed and began chronicling this battle, which was called the Castle Mission, where there was like a huge bombing raid, 300 planes on the city of Kassel, and one group of 35 bombers flew off course and were separated from the main bomber stream. And they lost their fighter protection, which at the time, this was September 27, 1944, they had very good fighter protection. It was not like in the early part of the air war where planes were being shot down by fighters left and right. Some of them had never even seen a German fighter plane up close. And here 35 planes became separated with no fighter protection, and the Germans scrambled every fighter plane they could. They flew over 5 German fighter bases, and they were ambushed by between 100 and 150 German fighter planes. And in this battle, which lasted minutes, 25 B-24s were shot down. A lot of the fighter planes were shot down. It was it's an incredible battle. And here, of the crews that were shot down, a lot of them survived and became prisoners of war. About half survived, half were killed. There were about 113 Americans killed in that battle. But Walter grew up, began doing all this research, and one day he located in San Francisco, through the Air Force Historical Society, he located the navigator who he had captured. And the two of them got together. In the meantime, a couple survivors of this battle had been collecting records and documents and accounts, and they formed a society, the Castle Mission Historical Society, to try and put together a book or some record of this little-known but spectacular air battle. So here, I'm in this little town in Germany, Heimbolzhausen, and I meet this German historian, and he got me interested in this battle, so I began interviewing survivors of this castle mission, and Corman Dean was a navigator on one of the planes that was shot down.
Poetry.
Oh, yes?
And a little bit of prose, but I got it out last night and I was reading it again, and some of it is really good.
Why don't you read a couple of poems? Have you written any poetry before?
Well, this isn't mine. This
That's
is
it?
a collection that I put together from several guys there in the prison camp, yeah. This is kind of long, but this is an ode to a P-38, O-D-E, to a P-38. Oh, Hetty Lamar is a beautiful gal. Madeline Carroll is too, but you'll find if you query a much different theory amongst any bomber crew. But the loveliest thing of which one can sing this side of the heavenly gates is no blonde or brunette of the Hollywood set, but an escort of P-38s. In all the days past when the tables were massed with glasses of scotch and champagne, it's quite true that that sight was a thing to delight us, intent on feeling no pain. But no longer the same nowadays in this game as we sail on to the missing state. Take your sparkling wine, but always make mine an escort of P-38s. Byron, Shelley, and Keats ran each other dead heats, describing the views from the hills of the valleys in Maine where the winds gently swayed, an army of bright daffodils. Take your daffodils, Byron, the wild flowers, Shelley. Yours is the myrtle, friend Keats. Just preserve me those cuties, all American beauties, an escort of P-38s. Sure, we're braver than hell, on the ground all is well. In the air, it's a much different story. As we sweat out our track through the fighters and flak, we're willing to split up the glory. Well, they wouldn't reject us, so heaven protect us until all this shooting abates. Give us courage to fight 'em, and another small item, an escort of P-38s.
Now, is there a name attached to that?
No, gotta know who put it together. Here's some excerpts that were collected from letters from home. First one, quote, "If you need any money, let me know," from his mother. Another one, "I find it difficult to live on your $200 allotment each month." Lieutenant BL from his wife. "We're not sending you any parcels. We hear you can buy everything you need in stores near your camp." From home. "I've been living with a private since you were gone. Please don't cut off my allotment, though, because he doesn't make as much money as you do. I'm going to file for a divorce. Mother and I have talked it over, and since you have been gone so long, we decided it was best. I knew I should have kept you home and joined the Air Corps myself. Even when you were a kid, I expected you'd wind up in prison."
That would make a book of itself.
Talk about a kick in the butt. The POW received a sweater from a woman through the ARC, and upon writing her a letter of thanks, received the following answer: "I'm sorry to hear that a prisoner received the sweater I knit. I intended it for a fighting man."
What's that one there?
This is a liberator's lament. "Early one crisp September morn, the planes began to roar. Into the wild blue yonder, they were going out to war. The target, it was Castle, and as such was highly cursed. And they, the old men's terror fleegers, were out to do their worst. We formed the 3-ship section, and then we formed the 6. But when we tried to form the group, the leader did some tricks. The inside ships were stalling, the outside did 210. The old man grabbed his microphone and yelled, 'Now listen, men. Though this looks like a milk-run mission, I want you all to know, when I go on a mission, it's bound to be a show. The bunch ahead, I'm sure you know, is a Flying Fortress group. So about the way we're gonna fly, now I'll give you some poop. The juries, they are tricky. They know that we're too new. They're expecting us to straggle, and they'll get us if we do. So this is what we plan to try if Jerry starts a fuss. We'll fly so close to the group ahead, they won't know which is us. Flying over Munster, where Jerry laid a trap, the old man took his tin hat off and laid it on his lap. He turned back to the engineer, and this is what he said: "If something must be shot away, I'd rather lose my head." That's supposed to get a laugh. Flying over Munster, where Jerry had laid a trap, the old man took his tin hat off and laid it on his lap. He turned back to the engineer, and this is what he said: "If something must be shot away, I'd rather lose my head." The flak was thick around us. The fighters, they were worse. But above the roar of battle, you could hear the old man curse. The vibration of the turrets made the instruments all dance. The colonel was so frightened he darn near filled his pants. Now Collar grew so anxious that his sights were synchronized. He sat there sweating drops of blood as all hell filled the skies. The bombs dropped out from all the ships. The crisis finally passed. The old man yelled, "Get out of here, and brother, I mean fast." We never completed that mission, though our air medal has a star, and we knew the crews were wishing that the group would build a bar. Because when a man has done a job that takes both guts and spunk, the one thing that he'd like to do is go get stinking drunk. No matter at all how brave you are, no matter, lad, how bold, a flyer's great ambition is to die from growing old. And when the flak is mighty thick, though he's a fighting man, the place a guy should like to be is back home on his camp.
Did it mention the word collar in there? Was that
Yeah.
collar?
That must have been written in prison camp by or about somebody that was on our mission, because they mentioned both collar and castle. And I may have put collars maybe. I don't know.
Could you have written that?
Pardon? No, I couldn't have written any of this stuff. Now Collar grew so anxious that his sights were synchronized, he sat there sweating drops of blood as all hell filled the skies. I hadn't had this out in years.
Isn't that the book that has your menus in it? Too? Did you have some menus in a book, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. When we were in prison camp and were well fed, adequately fed, the talk was all about girls and sex and stuff like that any young man would talk about. But when rations were scarce and everybody was hungry, all the talk turned to food. And everybody was obsessed with food. And so everybody sat down, a lot of guys sat down and wrote out the menus for their first week at home. But that was some psychologist would
Let's hear one of the menus.
Sunday breakfast, half a cantaloupe, waffles and maple syrup, eggs sunny side up, Vienna sausage, cream of wheat, pecan rolls, peanut butter, milk and coffee, and couldn't you do a good word? You couldn't get away from the table. Lunch, tomato consomme, scallop, corn candy, yams, mashed potatoes, roast pheasant, dressing, gravy, cottage cheese, lettuce pear salad, angel food cake with crushed strawberries a la mode, hot buns, cranberry sauce, milk, and coffee.
That sounds like it's your mother's house farm.
Yeah.
You must have written that one.
Well, yeah, I did that. This
That sounds like something your mother would serve.
Yeah. Shades of home. For you, the war is over. The flyers heard that phrase, but it took a while to sink in. We still felt slightly dazed. Short hours ago, our plane had roared through those skies above, still blue, with tons of death hung in her belly and a damn good fighting crew. For you, the war is over. You can make it what you please. Solitary, treatment rough, or else a life of ease. The information you can give can hurt you none at all. What is that phrase you Yankees use? Oh yes, how about playing ball? We can give you food and cigarettes and quarters as our own, or else some lead from a firing squad in a grave simply marked unknown. Your commander we know is Colonel Blank. You flew with the umpteenth group. All your training was done out west. You see, we had most of it too. He was still a kid with his life ahead, and he didn't want to die. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, this scene flashed through his eye. The boys of the group were back at the bar, and the old toast rang on high. Here's to those who have gone before, and here's to the next to die. He tried to laugh, but it wouldn't work. He hoped it was just a bluff. But if this bastard was telling the truth, it's certainly going to be rough. He was scared, it's true, but what the hell, he had played the game and lost. He had laughed at death up in the sky, and now he'd pay the cost. For me, the war's over, but you've sure got something there. But there's a million more just like me, and they'll be getting in your hair. You've got me where you want me, you can put me 'neath the grass. But I've got 5 words to say first, Major. Blowing out your ass.
That seemed to be a colloquial, isn't it?
Oh man, I didn't mean to, but that just...
I know, I couldn't figure out where you were last evening, you know, usually we were watching television together, you must have been reading those.
Yeah, I went 50 years and I didn't even think about this.
You know, this amazes even me. You know, the sound, the last poem is an example of what happens when the tape begins to degrade, and it kills me that I haven't done this with all of my tapes, but I'm working on it. Is it time, since there were no questions, for one last little excerpt? This goes back to Jim Flowers, the lieutenant who lost both of his legs in Normandy. He spent 3 years in the hospital, but he inspired me to write a book in which I interviewed as many of the people from his platoon that I could find. And even though I didn't interview this fellow, the doctor who treated him when he was brought down to the beach wrote a book called Battalion Surgeon, and it's kind of a classic. He wrote it right after the war. It's been through 3 printings. And he allowed me to use this little excerpt where he describes Jim Flowers being brought in, and 2 other cases. And he's talking about his experiences in Normandy. During these battles, I treated hundreds of wounded soldiers, and I saw many incredible things. Here I might mention 3 of the cases that stand out in my mind. The first concerned a young tank officer, a 2nd lieutenant. When his tank had been knocked out by an 88 during the fighting for Hill 122, one of his feet had been virtually torn off. He had pulled himself out of his disabled tank, and a passing aid man had stopped the bleeding and bandaged the wound. Then an enemy counterattack threw back the Americans. So for 2 days, the wounded man lay there in no man's land. During the seesaw fighting back and forth, many shells fell near him, and one large piece of steel shattered his other foot. The young fellow pulled off his belt and applied a tourniquet to the leg. Later, when one of my litter squads found him and brought him in, and I heard the story, I expected to see a moribund patient, but such was not the case. He was calm, cheerful, and not in shock. In fact, he was in excellent general condition, although both feet hung in tatters and would have to be amputated. When I remarked to him that he was in surprisingly good condition, he smiled and said, "Well, Doc, I just had the will to live." In the second case, a 19-year-old boy was wounded on patrol one night. He was the leading scout of a small patrol which ran into some heavy enemy machine gun fire, and he fell with a compound fracture of the femur, the thigh bone. He knew no one could find him in the darkness, so he crawled a half a mile back to his own lines. Don't ask me how he crawled on a broken femur, but he did. And he was not in shock when he arrived at the aid station sometime later. He said he needed no morphine, but I gave him some before I splinted his leg. "Is the chaplain here?" he asked. Then, as Captain Ralph Glenn, the Protestant chaplain with our battalion, stepped forward, the boy said, "Chaplain, I know that God spared my life out there tonight. Won't you please read from the Bible to me?" So as I worked, Chaplain Glenn read to the lad. The third is a dog story. One evening, a soldier was shot in the shoulder, so he started to walk back to the rear to the aid station, but he became lost in the darkness. Finally, he crawled into an abandoned foxhole to wait for morning. A short time later, he heard a noise and was ready to shoot when he saw that the noise was made by a little dog. The friendly mongrel jumped into the foxhole and curled up beside the boy, where he stayed all night long. The next morning after daylight, the soldier started off again in what he thought was the right direction. But the little dog tugged at his legs and made quite a scene, apparently trying to get the boy to go in the opposite direction. This the boy finally did. As it turned out, the dog led him back to the American lines. Had he kept on in the direction he selected, he would have walked into the German lines to death or some wretched prison camp. After we had dressed the soldier's wounded shoulder and laid him on a stretcher, the little dog jumped up on the boy's abdomen, lay down, and would not leave. Since the soldier had formed a strong attachment for his benefactor and did not want to leave him, we loaded the stretcher, soldier, dog, and all, into the ambulance and sent them on their way to the hospital. I always get a little choked up, but that's one of my favorite stories. Anyway, that probably takes up more time than I should have. Oh, Brandon?